Good evening, Allison.
Good evening.
You didn't have to wait that long to respond. This is a recording between you and I. I am a lawyer. You are a psychologist, right?
That is correct. You actually got it right this time.
So, I don't know where to go from here when you insult me at the first 30 seconds. Okay,
well,
so
maybe we should start over.
No, let's just keep going. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about your background first, and then delve into some questions about peer pressure and how people generally find themselves in a situation where there's peer pressure, how they can identify if they're being pressured by their peers, and how this is not just a kind of an issue for children or adolescents, but it's also an issue for adults, and why it can be somewhat dangerous for adults in the long run, financially, mentally, emotionally, things like that, and how sometimes they can be manipulated. I mean, that's what I would like to discuss and see where we can get to. But before we get there, Allison, I obviously you and I have known each other for 6 years, going on 10,
Correct.
and you are a psychologist.
Yep.
Would you mind just saying what your background is, your training, a little bit of your experience?
Yeah, so I have a doctorate in clinical psychology, and I have worked, my specialty is primarily with children, families, and transition-aged youth, which is 18 to 25. And I've also done some training in somatic and expressive arts as well. So using the body and art as a healing modality.
To become a psychologist, what type of learning do you have to do? I mean, it's beyond just college courses, right?
Yeah, so there's of course the regular graduate studies that you have to take, and then also I have a PhD, so I did a dissertation and did some original research. My dissertation was on transition-aged youth, looking at anxiety in relation to social media, and how that affects them, and what things that they can do in response to that anxiety that they experience in response to social media.
That your thesis that was about this social media and its influences on adolescents and youth. What type of research did you conduct in order to first identify what the issue was for your thesis, and then to actually reach a conclusion, whatever it was, for your thesis?
Well, I did extensive research of the current studies that have been done and the literature that is around social anxiety and social media. And then I conducted it was a really small scale study, looking at, and it was an experiential research model, which is a very unique type of model where I had them engage with social media and had them respond in different ways. A very qualitative study. It was not quantitative. Quantitative being, having a lot more numbers and facts. Qualitative being about the experience, and an experience for each person.
Now, you mentioned qualitative study for your thesis. Did you have to talk to people? Did you have to interact with people and get feedback from them?
Yeah, exactly. So basically it's like almost like an in-depth interview, right? So I'm interviewing them about their experience. They're telling me about their experience. And then also I'm having them engage. So I had them do an activity and I would interview them about their response to that activity, and what they were feeling in that moment, what their thoughts were. And then afterwards as well, having reflection about the whole process. So so in a qualitative study, the participants are a huge part of the findings and the outcome. I mean, in every study, of course, participants are a huge part, but what their experience is and how they interpret it is a huge part of the results at the end.
We're going to talk a lot about social media and the influence of social media on impressionable individuals. But is there a category or age group of people who are more impressionable due to social media, or is it just it hits the whole swath of individuals?
I think From what I have read and seen, I do think it affects all of us. One could probably argue that youth, just because of brain development, would be more susceptible because in youth until age 25, the prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. And that's our capacity for reasoning, logic, right? And so if that's not fully developed, we are going to be more susceptible to influence, to peer pressure, to all of those things. But social media is a very unique, what do I want to say?
Animal.
Animal is a great word. Yes. The unique beast, right? That definitely influences all of us. And we are all prone to being sucked into whatever rabbit hole we get down.
You were talking about the prefrontal cortex and the development of that for youth, but I mean, what is the cutoff? Is there a hard limit cutoff for that, or is it just an estimate?
Well, research initially had thought it was much younger, so they were thinking like early 20s, 18, and we've now seen that it's not until about 25. It isn't a hard cutoff, but we do see that it's still developing significantly until 25. Don't worry, as you get past that, your brain is still changing, developing, it still can grow. It doesn't become stagnant, but that is where the most growth does happen, is until 25.
Okay, so I'm going to take a little pause here because I want to ask this question, and it's going to take you a little while to answer the next question, but I want to pour the whiskey that you selected from my whiskey selection, and it's going to take a second. So, the whiskey you selected is Kaigan, Kaigan, Sakura Cask Expression, blended whiskey from Japan. It's got a wonderful box. It looks nice. Is that why you picked it?
Well, the box was beautiful, but the description on the back was also enticing.
Let's see, what is the description? A rich chocolate flavor is immediately evident with a bold richness and notes of sweet, toasted oak. The finish is mellow and fruity with hints of apricot and cherry, like being surrounded by the cherry blossoms in full bloom. That's what you liked?
Most definitely. I mean, we are in the Northern Hemisphere. It's spring right now. Things are blooming. Felt very fitting.
You're not afraid of the chocolate flavors in whiskey?
Well, I must say, that was a little bit of a question mark there, but the bottle still pulled me.
Okay.
I know you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but the bottle's really beautiful.
It is a nice bottle. And you can judge something by the look of the bottle, not so much the book. Okay. So, as I pour this, the question I wanted to ask you is this. When we talk about prefrontal cortex development, it's developing materially until 25, and it continues, your brain at least continues to develop until older age. What does it mean that your brain, your prefrontal cortex is developing? What does that entail? Like, what exactly are you learning as your prefrontal cortex develops?
I mean, what is happening, right? In youth, it's problem solving, it's reasoning, it's being logical, right? So that's why youth might seem like they are making choices one day that are pretty logical, and then another day maybe they make a choice that isn't so logical, right? They might decide to do something else a little risky, right? Or maybe not study for their test, or when really they're a really good student, right? So those types of things are all the prefrontal cortex is what allows us to be able to make rash decisions, be logical about things. And so when that's developing, it means that we are not fully capable all the time to do that. And so that's why some of that other behaviors are more likely and tend to happen more in youth.
Is there a model prefrontal cortex so you can say this one is fully developed or it's mature or something like that?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. Do you know of any science behind that?
I mean, they study the brain there's tons of imaging of the brain, and we can see how the brain has developed, and we can see where areas are not as developed or more developed. Is there an ideal brain? I don't know if that. I don't know. I haven't looked at that research.
I'm sure there's some political individuals in the world who believe that their brains are the ideal brains.
Probably.
Yeah, we should study those brains out of their heads.
That sounds like a good idea.
Okay, so the whiskey is poured, the Kaigan. Cheers.
Cheers.
I don't smell chocolate.
Was chocolate supposed to be on the nose or on the taste?
Probably taste.
I smell like orange.
It's actually very smooth. This is a really good tasting blend. I get a little bit of orange. I don't taste the chocolate, but I do taste a little bit of the apricot.
Yeah, I'm in agreement.
Pretty smooth.
Very smooth.
I don't know if the oakiness is coming out, but you don't like oak.
I don't mind oak, but no, I'm agreeing. I don't think the oakiness is coming out.
Decent?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's talk a little bit about peer pressure. In your studies and in your experience with youth, and as you provide guidance and therapy for youth, do you see peer pressure as a significant hurdle or issue for people up to 25 years old? And the reason I say 25 years old is because that's generally considered the end of the development of the prefrontal cortex or slow down of the development of the prefrontal cortex. So I'm going to use that number if that's okay.
Yeah.
So again, so up to 25, do you see that individuals are facing peer pressure more and more, or do you feel that peer pressure is not as much an issue as something else?
I mean, I think all of us, right, have faced peer pressure. I think that's a common thing that happens in probably, I mean, maybe elementary school, but I'd probably say starting in middle school, moving into high school. And, a lot of that, there's a desire to fit in. And even as adults, right, we desire to fit in. And so, there's that, the pressure from peers, right, or peers saying, wanting to do something, it's much harder to stand separate of that than to necessarily go with it.
If an individual, I mean, let's say that their upbringing was not to rebel, not to question, not to be apart from a group, whatever group that was, and that's how they grew up. And as they become adults, can they separate from that groupthink mentality, or do you feel like most often, or more often than not, it's more difficult to step away from a group?
I don't think it actually matters on the upbringing. I think for all of us, we are a species that is clan-based and that wants our group. We want group belonging. And so it's going to be much harder for anyone, doesn't matter what that group is, but to step away from a group. People do it. We can be, we do have that individualistic, especially here in the United States, right? That's a huge part of our culture. But that wanting to be a part of a group is safer. And so that is just harder to necessarily step away from it.
So it wouldn't matter if you're an adult who's 26 versus an adult who's 75. If you found yourself in a group, you find comfort in that group setting.
Yeah, I'm not saying, and of course there's going to be people who don't find comfort in that setting, but I would say if you think broadly, I mean, we can't talk individually because all of us are so unique and different, but broadly, as human beings, it doesn't matter your age, we tend to like to be connected with some sort of group.
So this, the reason I'm asking all these questions is because for 9 years, I've been championing individuals to think for themselves as far as audio gear is concerned. And that's such a niche society, community, right? You don't understand it. You don't want to understand it. But I think it's a microcosm of a lot of things. I mean, recently I've had videos / podcasts talking about peer pressure, talking about influence from influencers like on YouTube and forums and things like that. And I started thinking that it's not relegated to just hobbies like audio. It's everywhere around us. I mean, that's why we have such groupthink and such strong emotional ties to, say, political parties, religious beliefs, things like that. And those are groups too, right?
Correct. Those are definitely groups. And it can feel, even if it's unconscious, I'll say it's not always us being a part of a group is not always a conscious decision. I would say probably a lot of the times it's unconscious, but we feel safer in it, right? It feels like we know where we stand, right? If we're outside of that group, there might be a lot of uncertainty, not knowing, will we be taken care of? Will we be safe? I mean, all those fears can come up. And so it's much safer to be like, okay, I'm a part of this group.
And you're not saying that it's wrong to be in a group.
No, not at all.
I mean, is it healthy for people to find a group, to have a belonging in that group?
I think it can be. Of course, we have seen across cultures and societies that there's groups that have not been healthy for individuals, but humans are a social being, right? So we're being social, and having our community is really important. And I think communities are a really important thing that helps society and brings us together.
You mentioned that there are examples where it's not healthy. Can you give an example so that we understand what you're talking about?
Not going to remember the name, and so I apologize for that, but there's been very closed knit communities, or we could call them cults, where maybe there was abuse happening in them, and or people didn't have freedoms and didn't realize necessarily that there was maybe something outside of that.
Yeah, and I think the classic example that's often talked about in media and even in school is like Reverend Moon's cult. Yeah. And all these cults sprang up in the late 60s, 70s, and they became kind of a boogeyman in the 80s that these cults exist. Not that they don't exist even now, but the classic example is the cults from the 70s, where people had donned very simple clothes, lived on communes, and some of these cults had just females essentially turning into sex slaves for the male who was leading the cult. I mean, is that essentially what you're referring to?
Yeah, that is what I'm referring to. And I would say I don't think all communes or community living has to be negative, right? But it had those negative ones, yes, is what I was referring to.
So this leads me to the next kind of topic or concern, is that like I've seen that in hobbies like in audio gear. I've commented a lot, I've talked a lot about, in the last 9 years, gear. And it's all subjective. Everybody has different experiences with what they're using, and some people might like it, some people might dislike it, and that's fine. But if somebody says something negative about a product, there's inevitably a group of individuals who either own the product, have tried the product, or haven't, who jump on top of that negative comment or review or opinion, and it becomes very, very toxic. Is that due to an inability to empathize with the negative opinion or the person who's making that opinion? Is that a defense mechanism? I mean, how would you characterize individuals who have a kind of a toxic reaction to an opinion that they don't personally hold?
I think it could be a lot of things. So I think it's hard to necessarily generalize, but I think, yes, in some ways it's probably, I would just gander that it's reactive, right? It's being defensive. It's, maybe there is some part of the person that might feel like they're being attacked. And so then attacking back. And also all of us know, right, on the internet, it's an easy way to share our opinions, and maybe share really strong opinions against something because it might feel safe because we're behind a screen and we don't actually have to show our face or show ourselves, right? And can just write whatever we want. And, I think those types of forums, like YouTube, and if you're having YouTube comments, right, it can make things maybe more inflammatory than necessarily if you're talking to someone face on face.
So essentially what, the way I look at it is if some of these people made these comments, these toxic, aggressive comments in person, I mean, there might be a risk that person might react in a similar negative way, and it could devolve and it could turn into, if not verbally hostile, then physically hostile, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, then I think about how people on the internet, forums, websites, whatever, they comment, and they tend to comment in such a hyperbolic way, in such an overblown way. and everything is the end of the world. Doesn't matter what the issue happens to be in politics and hobbies, whatever. Everything is just the end of the world, and it's almost like anything that goes against that individual's thought process or comfort zone is so dangerous to their well-being that they must react in a strong and decisive way. Does that track with you?
I think the reason as to why they react, we can't actually know. I think that would be a personal reason. But yes, they're reacting, right? And they're not actually, there's a theory that looks at like how do we the difference between responding to a situation versus reacting, right? Reacting is when we let our emotions lead and we just react to what's happening in front of us. Rather, responding is when we can take a moment and be able to choose how we respond or, in response to something. So, for example, if someone said something that upset you, a reaction might be you might yell at them back, right? Where a response would more so be you might take a breath, you might realize, oh, wait, maybe they are, that wasn't really about me. You think about it a little bit more. And so then you can create or decide how you want to respond to that person rather than just reacting.
So, okay. So let's take a different look at audiophilia. I've been saying for years that there's a concerted effort by a large group of individuals, like reviewers and article writers, bloggers, magazines, to hype products. And because my belief is that they hype products because they want personal financial gain. Reviewers on YouTube, for example, get larger audiences. I mean, and this is not in dispute. They get larger audiences out of hype. The more subscribers that they have, the greater chance it is that they're going to get greater subscribers through social media. And it's a self-perpetuating machine then. The larger you grow, the more money you will make off of ad revenue, off of personal merchandise that you sell with your name on it, and also with doing collaborations and selling gear through affiliate links and all that sort of stuff. Okay. So my argument has been for years that the reviewers are purposefully hyping products. Now, if that is the case, right? Let's assume that just for the sake of argument that may be the case. If that is the case, does that have any effect on individuals who, for example, who do not have a fully developed prefrontal cortex, where they're constantly being inundated by the hype of products that they're interested in, say in audio gear?
I think it's called advertising, right? Advertising wants us to buy things. And so if you are just quote unquote selling a product through your review of it or, hyping it, then I think anyone, right, is going to be more susceptible to wanting maybe that product if it's talked well of and they're continuing to see reviews that are talked well of it.
So what about how this kind of turns into peer pressure? What if I'm a young 25-year-old a long time ago? Let's assume that I am currently a young 25-year-old. And there's a reviewer that I like, or a set of reviewers that I like. I like their personalities. I like the flashy visuals that they have on their videos. I like the music. All sorts of stuff, right? I like them. And they are constantly promoting things for me to buy. They're always saying, this is amazing. This is the best thing I've ever seen. This is the best thing I've ever handled. It's the best thing I've ever heard. And it's X amount of money. It's better than anything else out there. And every week there's something like this that's being thrown out. How would that affect somebody like me in that hypothetical? Again, I'm 25 or younger, and I'm faced with this from individuals that I look up to.
Well, I think if you are building a trust of them, which it sounds like you are, like, right, you like them, you think that what they're doing is correct, then yeah, you would probably want to buy those products.
Why is that? Why would that be the trigger? Why wouldn't it be, I want to think about this. I want to try to find the negative reviews. I want to find, more critical assessment.
Well, it could have something to do with that we are, all of us, no matter your age, have biases, and they're just sort of how our brain works. And one of those is a confirmation bias, where a confirmation bias is where we look for things that prove what we like. And so if we like that person or we like that thing that they're selling, we're going to look at those things that continue to prove that, and we won't look for those things that disprove that.
Is there a way for people to identify when they're being pressured by their peers or people that they look up to? I mean, is there some sort of technique that people can employ to kind of check?
I mean, I think the first thing is just being aware, right? So being aware of different types of biases, because that can tune you in for you to just notice and question yourself. Like, am I only looking at reviews that support this product? If we're going to go for products, right? Or am I looking at other reviews what are some of the negative reviews for that product, right? Do you believe with them? Do you think that there could be some validity to that, right? Just really using your critical mind to be able to think through and just see, are you looking at both the negative and the positive about a product or anything in that matter?
Well, do you see any psychological parallels between childhood peer dynamics and how adults behave in niche communities like hobby communities like audiophiles?
I don't know if I actually can answer that question. Just I think I probably have not studied or looked at research enough between like how peer pressure is in youth and how that relates to hobbies. I mean, that would be a very specific study.
Okay, so how about this? Do you think that intelligent, well-meaning adults can still fall into irrational or trend-driven behavior? Because we've been talking about. I mean, these are 25 years old. I mean, that person is an adult, right?
Yeah.
And at 35, 45, 55, there's no. We see this across the wide spectrum of age groups where people do in fact make certain decisions that, in hindsight, were influenced by let's say marketing, or it was influenced by peer pressure. So why do you think that people who are otherwise very intelligent individuals in their own right still fall for this sort of stuff?
Because it's unconscious. I mean, so right, it's an unconscious bias that we have, and I think we're going back to the very beginning of our conversation in regards to groups and wanting to feel connected. It's easier to go with than to go against. And us as humans, there's research that's been shown that we also want to do what's easy, right? We don't necessarily, not that we don't do things that are hard, but just, motivation. We often will say that like that person, someone's not motivated, right? And put that on the quality of who they are, where in reality, motivation is something you really have to cultivate. And it takes a lot of work to be able to cultivate being motivated. And so to be motivated to go outside of or to think different from, it takes a lot of work. It's much easier to just go with.
Okay, so in that vein, it's so much easier to go with. Now, so when people find themselves in say niche communities like online forums, would you agree that doesn't matter what age group right now? Would you agree that they're trying to look for some sort of understanding or belonging? I mean, they're a new audiophile. Let's say they're a new audiophile. They don't know anything about anything, and so where do they go for information? YouTube, forums. So they go to forums, and at that point, is that person who's new to the hobby susceptible to influence because they recognize that they don't know anything and they're going to individuals who've been in these forums for years?
I don't know definitely, but I'd probably say yes. Yeah, in the sense that, right, if we don't know something and we think that we're going to people that are experts, we have a tendency to put a lot of weight on those that hold titles of expertise, and so then might believe them more if we think that they're an expert.
So an individual who doesn't know anything goes into, say, a forum and asks questions. That individual is placed in a place of I guess not just the ability to be or the opportunity to be influenced, but also they're just vulnerable, generally speaking, to any sort of peer pressure.
Potentially. And I will just say, too, I think it really depends on the person, right? If you're going into it being really thinking critically of what's being said and, maybe relating it to something else you learned and getting information from elsewhere and, sort of doing your own critical thinking and research on the topic and different things, then not necessarily.
All right. So the other thing I've been championing and asking people to do is their own critical thinking, right? Trying to step away from the groupthink, trying to independently verify things by going to Google and finding articles and actual research material. And yet I keep finding the resistance from individuals in these groups, right? And they just quote other people who are in the same group, in the same forum, and saying, yeah, but this person who's been around for X amount of time is saying this, and they have all this equipment and they're saying it. Mm-hmm. But that's not an independent investigation, right?
No.
Why?
No.
Why is that?
Well, because you're still within your group, right? And so you're not actually doing your own research. And when you're in group, that can create a lot of biases. There might be multiple viewpoints in that group, but as groups become more cohesive, the viewpoint becomes narrower as more to one.
So let's try to game this, right? Let's try to figure out how this happens, how it evolves. I create a group. I create a website dedicated to whatever. Let's say it's dedicated to my dog, Pinto. And he's the greatest dog in the world, and I truly believe that he's the greatest dog in the world. And I want other people to partake in this belief that he's the greatest dog in the world. And the forum is open to all. The forum grows over time. For whatever reason, people who haven't met my dog believe that he's the greatest dog in the world. And at some point, people start believing that my dog Pinto is the greatest dog in the world, even though they've never met him. Is that realistic? Does that sort of stuff happen, or is that just make-believe?
I mean, I think I can say pretty clearly, yes, that it does happen. You keep mentioning groupthink, and I keep coming back to the very classic example of groupthink, which is in 1986, there was the decision to launch the Space Shuttle Challenger, mm-hmm. but there was some concerns that a certain part would malfunction in the cold. And there's a few scientists or engineers that, spoke up about this, but the group was so strong that they launched anyway. And it was a disaster, right? We know that the Challenger exploded and they didn't make it. And so that is a really classic example of how groupthink, people believing something or wanting to believe something. And what happens with groupthink is that there's this belief of kind of being invincible, like it can't go wrong, right? If enough of us believe it can't go wrong. Other thing that happens in groupthink is you minimize the negative. So you minimize the risk. So in this example, right, they were minimizing the actual risk that would happen by this piece malfunctioning. And the other thing that can happen with groupthink is other negative opinion, or I don't want to say negative opinions, but the dissenting, right, the dissenting vote or the person that's going to go against is not, they won't speak up. Because they might feel like they're going to get ostracized. They might feel like that the other people will, be negative towards them or get mad at them, or, there's a lot of reasons as to why they wouldn't necessarily speak up. And so then maybe they're quiet, maybe they just go along with it. So if it's, everyone, to get back to your point around, your dog Pinto being the amazingest dog ever, maybe not everyone believes it, but maybe they don't go against it, right? So there's that can happen too in groups.
And just as a side note, I'm so glad that you brought up the Challenger, because that's a very interesting case study. I mean, it's an unfortunate fact, but the individual who really brought this to light was the person involved in creating the information outlet. Essentially, was Richard Feynman, the phenomenal physicist. And Richard Feynman got onto the investigation board. Not that he wanted to, but he was appointed by the president, Ronald Reagan at the time. And through his own investigation and through engineers providing him information on the down low, essentially, people who had concerns like you talked about, he found out that it was an O-ring. It was an O-ring that was subjected to various temperature changes over several days as the space shuttle sat on the launch pad for day after day, and record-setting low temperatures, which caused the O-ring to contract. And so when it was warm enough to launch the space shuttle, it was deformed. And so when it finally launched, that deformed O-ring created a gas outlet, which then ignited and caused a spark, which destroyed the space shuttle in mid-launch. But it's important to highlight that critical thinking and identifying that there's an issue requires another step. Not just that you know something might be amiss, that something isn't, the groupthink and the people telling you, and everything is fine, don't worry about it, let's just launch this shuttle. That if you go along with it, bad things can happen. And that's an extreme example, right?
Yes, a very extreme example.
But how could that happen in real life? Say I'm in a forum and I believe that audio cables, which are analog, right? Let's say an RCA cable, it makes the sound better if I spend $1,000 on one audio cable, because people in that forum tell me you need to spend money on an audiophile cable, which is an expensive $1,000 cable. And you have no right to say anything negative until you've listened to it yourself. And this is reality. This is not hypothetical. This realistic situation, when it happens, what type of concern would you have for the receiving end, for the person who's new, who's potentially vulnerable? What do you think would happen to them, their thought process, as they're getting this information?
Well, I think I can speak probably from someone I love audio and music, but I wouldn't say I'm an audiophile. But, I could feel like I needed to buy it, right? I could feel really pressured that was the thing that I really needed to buy, and that, nothing would sound the same if I didn't have that.
Why would you think that? I mean, and why would you think that, number two, would that thought process be different for a 55-year-old versus a 25-year-old?
Well, I would probably think that, to answer your first question, I'd probably think that if I thought that person was an expert, right? If I thought that they were an expert in the field of audiophiles, and that's not the right word, is it? Audiophilia?
Yeah, but it sounds a little bit too like pedophilia to me. So let's just say it's audio lovers.
All right. So, right, if it's an expert within the field, then that would make me think that they were correct, right? I would put that unconscious bias on that they had to be correct because they are quote unquote an expert. I think probably people who are younger would be more susceptible because just their prefrontal cortex is not developed as much. And so that ability to critically think could make them more susceptible. But I would say older adults can also be just as susceptible. So,
okay. So now I want to turn a little bit to something else. Not just people who are impressionable, but individuals who are creating the atmosphere to influence others. Right? I have been staunchly against, say, personalities, whether they're reviewers or bloggers or whoever, who go out of their way to hype, who go out of their way to make financial gain for themselves off the backs of the influenced, of the people who are watching them or reading them. And in my view, I think this is patently obvious that it happens over and over and over again. That certain reviewers, just limited to YouTube, certain reviewers on YouTube, their only job is YouTube. They don't have another source of income. We verify this. We know this. They admit to it. Their only source of making a living is YouTube. Do you think an individual who's, and correct me if I'm wrong, right? You don't have to agree, but do you think that an individual who's making a living, whose sole or principal income is from, quote unquote, reviewing audio gear, do they have an incentive whatsoever to make as much money as possible, to sell as much as possible, to hype as much as possible, but still do it in a way that they feel like they're not hyping, that they're not inflating, that they're not influencing?
I don't know. I mean, if something is someone's job, I think that right? They would want to make as much money as possible doing it. So, and we have ways that we will tell ourselves that we're not doing that. So I've seen that, not necessarily, I don't know for audiophiles in particular, but yeah, I mean, right, if we think that what we are doing is correct or right, we can justify doing things that are potentially negative.
Would you be able to explain to me why people disregard warning signs of reviewers or people in positions of influence when the warning signs are very clear? The warning signs being it's their only source of income. That's how they make money. They have positive reviews constantly over and over and over again. They continually talk about expensive gear being the best. Or if not that, at least have affiliate links for even cheap gear, making money off of that and giving promotions. Why is it that people kind of disregard the warning signs?
I mean, the first thought that comes to my mind, though, is that it's easier, right? It's easier to just believe than to critically think.
And obviously, we're not talking about any specific individual. You're not diagnosing anybody, but we're talking a lot in general terms. And as you say, everybody's different, everybody's unique, and there might be various factors involved with a person refusing to acknowledge the patently obvious, right?
Yeah.
Is there a way to get out of this stuff? Like, one view of it is some people would say that audiophilia is a cult, or believing in certain ridiculous things about audiophilia is cultish behavior. I think I can see where the cult title comes from. Would you say that? So I'll give you an example. People believe that a hockey puck that has some glass on it, it is the size and the weight of a hockey puck. You put it in a corner of your room. By the way, it has no cables. It has no batteries, nothing. You put it in the corner of a room. That this hockey puck is going to absorb the electromagnetic radiation emanating from the universe. I mean, you know what I'm talking about, like electromagnetic radiation from the universe, right? Yeah, of course.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. It will absorb all the electromagnetic radiation coming from the universe, your environment, your phone, your TV, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? This is patently bullshit. It is not true. It is clearly wrong, but it costs $1,000. And people, not everybody, but some people, believe this to be true. And I call that insane thinking. Are people who believe in the absolute absurd, that is scientifically absurd, provably wrong, are they in a cult?
I don't know. I'd wonder what the definition of a cult is.
What would be your definition? What would be a psychologist's definition of a cult? So let's say, would you say that a cult is a small number of individuals who would die for a belief?
Yeah, that's probably one definition of a cult.
Okay. Would a large number of individuals also fit that description?
Yeah.
Well, wouldn't that be calling a religion a cult then?
Well, some people
that was a trick question.
Some people do call religion a cult, so.
You don't. You don't call religion a cult. I call religion a cult, but that's me. Okay. Let's assume.
Might depend on the sector. Anyway, we're not going down that.
Right. So let me look up the definition of cult, because this is going somewhere. I want to make sure we have the definition. Okay. So the definition of a cult is this: a cult is generally defined as a social group or movement with 1, unquestioning devotion to a charismatic leader or ideology; 2, isolation from outside influences, often including friends, family, or broader society; 3, manipulative or coercive tactics used to control members' thoughts, behaviors, or beliefs; 4, rigid belief system often presented as the sole path to truth or salvation; and 5, punitive measures, emotional, psychological, or physical, for dissent or disobedience. So that's the the textbook definition of a cult.
Yes.
Do you remember the example I gave you?
Yes, the
Generally.
hockey puck with
The
the
hockey
glass.
puck thing. Yeah.
back.
Okay.
Yeah, the corner of the room. Yes.
Right. People who believe that sort of stuff, right? Not just about the hockey puck, but also about audio cables making a difference, which they don't. Audio cables making a difference because you have to spend $1,000 or $10,000 on a cable. You don't. If people who refuse to listen to science, which is clear on the subject and is readily available for free, mind you, are they in a cult? Given this definition?
No.
Okay, good. I want to be abundantly clear, and I hope that you agree, Allison, that when we start name calling each other, we say the other side is in a cult. We're not promoting discourse.
Correct.
And that it's not helpful. I mean, yeah, we can disagree with the person who says this hockey puck is going to suck up the universe's electromagnetic radiation. It won't. We can disagree with them. We can point them to science. We can tell them why it's wrong. But at the end of the day, it's their choice to believe and spend their money as they wish.
Correct.
And it's not helpful at all to anybody for us to say, well, they're in a cult.
Probably not. And actually, that would be, going back to the beginning of our conversation, right? Around group and group being. And by saying someone else is in a cult, you're probably also associating yourselves with some other type of group, right? That, maybe it's the group that's quote unquote outside the cult, right? And then with groups, we also have othering, right? So then you're othering. And by othering, you distance yourself and create less, there's a less capacity to be able to build connection and bridges.
So just to be clear, you said othering, OHTHERING, which is making somebody outside the group, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. What would be a better way to have a discourse? Let's say you disagree with somebody who clearly holds patently absurd, scientifically reality-based absurd notions and beliefs that are financially detrimental to themselves and potentially to other people that they're influencing. What's the way that we begin the discourse to at least get that person's attention, to have them reassess?
I think it's hard because if someone doesn't want to have the conversation, we can't force people to do things. So we get into a stuck position, right? Because if someone's not willing to have a conversation or to look at other evidence or to question what they believe, then it really does create a challenge because you can't force someone to change how they think or to look at something.
Is there anything in your experience which would help us explain why there's such a prevalence of absurd beliefs? I mean, it just feels like every day somebody says something so outrageous that they could easily verify or disprove, and they choose not to, and they still just keep promoting these absurd statements or beliefs. Is there a reason?
My guess is everyone has a different reason as to why. But I mean, I think one thing that beliefs can get spread, especially nowadays, there's a lot of research being done on social media and how that's affecting how we think. And especially because social media has algorithms that are tailored to only perpetuate what we are looking at and or believe in. And so we're all in our own little bubbles around what we believe. And so none of us are getting the diversity of news I mean, like information, right? It doesn't have to be actual like news about politics, but just like information, right? We're not getting diverse information. We're only getting what we want to see or are looking at. And it's really hard with social media to get outside of that. The other thing that happens is that the spread of information is much faster, right? So before social media, someone might say something, but it was really hard for that one thing to spread to a whole lot of people. But now it's really easy for someone anywhere to say one thing and for that to spread to a lot of people and them to share it for other people. And so then that just sort of, I would say, probably be part of that perpetuating of an idea, no matter what that idea is, how true it is or not true.
Do you see that we're putting a lot of status on people who are influencers in social media influencers, whether it's TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, Not Twitter anymore because that's X, and nobody's an influence on X because it's a terrible website. But places like that, are we putting too much stock into individuals who have big followings, who have flashy visuals, who seem to be traveling the world and doing amazing things, and while we sit on the couch?
My short answer is yes. I mean, they are doing that for influencers are paid to do those things, right? And they're paid to curate a life. I mean, I talk to teens all the time and talk about the challenges of being a teenager with social media. I just want to say I'm glad that I was not, because there's this idea that they then have that their life has to be a certain way or look this certain way, and if it's not this way, then they are failing in some way. And that really isn't true, because life is complex. Life is really hard and messy, and we are human. We are fallible, right? There is no such thing as perfection. And so that ideal that often, especially I see, what teenagers are following, or just what's out there, right, is an idea that's promoting an idea of perfection, which is not true. There is, we can strive for perfection, but we will never reach perfection because we are human.
And that's a good point. I mean, people say that they found the thing, right? This is the vacation experience that you will always want to take, right? This, if you go anywhere, this is the place you want to go, and these are the places you want to visit, right? Or this is the piece of gear that you absolutely need. This is the best thing ever. Saying things like that, does that have any influence on people?
Probably. I mean, right? If someone says that enough, you'll start to believe it. And that also has to do with, too, right? Sometimes if we hear something enough, we'll believe it more. It doesn't matter if it's true or not, right? If we hear something more times, we tend to believe it more.
All right. So let me give you a concrete, it's not a hypothetical, concrete scenario. This has happened in the past, right? I've been saying for years, how many years now? 7 years, 8 years, whatever, that DACs, you understand what a DAC is, right? We've talked about it. Yeah, okay. That DACs generally, for the most part, sound the same. And I've done tests and all this stuff, and I go through the whole litany of things. And there are other individuals who were saying for that same amount of time, that's not true. And individuals, I mean, like social media influencers, that's not true. And every DAC has a different sound. And now they've changed their minds. And now they're kind of changing their tune. And recently, the last couple of years, they've been saying, and things have changed so much. They all practically sound the same, blah, 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 blah. Now, this change, this abrupt change in their viewpoint, does that have any jarring effect on anybody who's been watching them and believing them when they've been saying up until recently, all DACs sound different? Or do these followers adapt?
I don't know. From some things that I've seen, I don't know. I guess where my thought is going, it might depend on how much they believe the individual, right? If they're really attached to that individual and almost make them as this super person, right? That they are believing no matter what, they might not think of it or critically think of the discrepancy of that.
Is it possible for influencers to negatively influence others through hype and yet still believe that they are not hyping, that they're not doing something that's destructive?
Yeah.
Is that like a defense mechanism for people, or is that it's just that their way of thinking, that what they're doing is not wrong or hurtful?
I think for the most part, I believe that humans on a whole are not intentionally harmful. Of course, there are some people that are, and there are some people that do cause harm, and that is what they do, and they are intentionally causing harm. But I think for the most part, people believe what they are doing is good, and so their judgment gets clouded. They see things from a very specific way, and they're not necessarily looking at all the ways that their actions or behaviors are might be causing harm. Because to think that what we are doing is causing harm or bad, that's like really hard to hold. And so we do things, our brain does things to make us believe that we're not causing harm.
And it's easier for the brain to just kind of block that part out.
Yeah, or it's not necessarily blocking out. I would say it's probably like a rewriting of the story in a way. It's right. It's telling the story in a way that makes us believe that what we're doing is positive.
And on that subject of positivity, is too much positivity a bad thing?
What do you mean?
Okay. I'm glad you asked that. So a person is always positive about gear that they're reviewing, audiophile gear. They're always positive, or the majority is positive. They review hundreds of items over the course of a year, let's say, right? Or 100 items. And over that 100 items, they give 95 items a positive review. And they say, this is amazing. This is what you need to buy next. This is the next best thing, et cetera, et cetera. And only 5 out of those 100 do they give a negative commentary about it. And even that negative commentary is not particularly negative. It's just kind of watered down. In this scenario, an individual who gives these types of feedback, this review, I mean, don't they understand that their words have impact on the people they're influencing? That the 95% of the time that they're saying this is amazing, it'll actually hit on people who are being influenced, who are susceptible to influence, to peer pressure, to God-like. They're looking at their God. They're looking at the person that they look up to for whatever reason. They have a broken home. They don't have friends. They want to be that person, and they want to emulate that person. They believe that person is intelligent. They believe that person is an expert, etc. Whatever the reasons are. I mean, don't these creators, these influencers, understand that what they're doing is inherently dangerous? Or do you feel like that's just the way things are now?
I mean, I think it would be an interesting question to ask them.
Yeah, they never want to answer that question because they're too chicken shit.
I mean, I think they know that they're influencing. That is what their job is. And that is what is, right? We have created that job in our society now with social media, that is an okay job to do.
There have been people who had a full-time job and they became YouTubers. And then they just decided, well, YouTubing is going to be my full-time thing. I mean, it still baffles me as somebody who still has a full-time job. You have a full-time job. And just walk away from a full-time job to become a YouTuber is insane. It's still insane to me because I have an old mind. But young people today, they actually believe that this is a thing. This is an occupation. You can be a YouTuber. You can make millions off of YouTube, right?
Yeah. And people are doing it. And I don't think it's necessarily all bad. I think, right, we have access to some amazing content and for free. And we have access to...
Like mine. Amazing content for free, like mine. But keep going. Yeah, keep going.
Right? And we can learn things and we can learn from people all over the world in such a different capacity than we ever have been able to. So I don't think it's necessarily all negative, but with anything, there's always going to be a negative aspect of it. There just always is. Nothing is ever going to only be positive. Our world is way too complex. So it won't.
Okay. I think we talked about a lot, and I'm really enjoying this whiskey.
Yes, the whiskey is very good.
This whiskey is very good. Yeah. It's called Kigan, Kigan. They are not sponsoring us. I would like them to sponsor us. I know that they have different blends. This is the cheapest blend that I found. And I would like more blends. They're not gonna watch this. They're in Japan, apparently. But as we close, I want to pose a real question. Not that the rest of the questions were not real, but this is a heartfelt question that's been weighing on me for quite a while, and it might be long-winded. So forgive me if it is long-winded. I feel personally affronted, angry, upset that we now have a society which champions stupidity, which champions individuals not thinking critically, not thinking for themselves. It offends me so personally. But I find it insulting as a human being that we are now expected to simply accept whatever we're told. I find it even more offensive that young people are doing that, because they are, I mean, not to sound pedantic, but they are the future. They are the people who are going to become voters and not vote. They are the individuals who are going to decide the rest of the world's fate. They are the individuals who will have to make decisions. And if they can't critically think now, how are they going to be able to muster that critical analysis when real important things come up? But that's what affronts me. That when I look at audiophilia, it's such a stupid hobby. Honestly, it's such a dumb, stupid money pit of a hobby. It's so subjective. It's so stupid. You can enjoy music through a $3 speaker as much as you can through a $15,000 speaker. It is so damn stupid. And yet, we, including me, fall into the group. And yet we, including me, fail to use critical thinking about this stupid, useless, pointless, pathetic hobby. That we're doing such a poor job with this. How can we possibly be good stewards of each other, our communities, our country, and in general terms, how we treat the world? What's your viewpoint on that?
I actually have a lot of hope on our youth. The youth I work with, I have a lot of hope of what the future will hold. But the critical thinking piece, it goes back to our school system. We don't teach critical thinking in school anymore, in the education system. And this is in the United States. So, right, we're not teaching that. And so if we're not teaching that, then how can they know? Because I do think that no matter, even with the prefrontal cortex not fully developed, you can learn to critically think, and you can learn to critically think as a teenager, and you can a young adult, and be able to think critically through things. But our public education system is not teaching that. And so that is where we're really failing, I think, our youth. And partly don't know if I should go here, but I will. But partly I think it has to do is it's to have control of a society. It's easier if people aren't critically thinking about it.
Yeah, and getting them distracted on superfluous, pointless things is a way to get control over them. Yep. I mean, that movie that came out in the early 2000s, Idiocracy, if you haven't watched it, watch it. It is eerily too similar to reality in 2025. That's what basically it was. People in the future, in the movie Idiocracy, people in the future are so stupid that the entire world has gone to shit because they're influenced by peer pressure, they're influenced by social media, they're influenced by advertisement, and there's no free will. There's only stupid people doing what the advertisers say.
I don't look so critically on humanity. I don't think that people as a whole are stupid. I think we are being bombarded by a lot of information, and when we are in a world that has so much information coming at us, there's only so much we can hold, and so our mind filters things and we go for what will be easier. Also, there's a lot of big companies and people that are gaining a lot of money off of this, and so they have a lot of motivation to continue it. I mean, I always found it really interesting when I was way back, like with the start of social media, the people that developed it didn't have their kids on it. They very clearly did not allow their kids to be on it and their teenagers to be on it. And so I just find that really interesting. They knew what they were doing. They knew what it would affect. And so here we put this thing and we created it, and, it without the warning labels, without those things. And I'm not saying it's all bad. I think there's a lot of positive that social media can do for adults and youth as well. We are in this age of social media, but I also believe, right? I mean, there's also something to be said when the people that created it very clearly did not have their children on it. I think that says a lot.
Well, I guess you could say that for a lot of things. I mean, I remember in the odd 80s, whatever it was, when Congress had hearings about the dangerousness of rock music. And I forget who it was. It wasn't Kiss. I forget who it was. But a band was called into congressional hearings to testify. Do you remember? Was it Twisted Sisters?
I don't remember.
I want to say it was Twisted Sisters. Because I love Twisted Sisters. It could have been Twisted Sisters. And I just, it kind of echoes back to that we got to be careful about how we monitor access to information, including music and opinions and all that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah. Yes. I totally. I don't necessarily think it should. I'm forgetting the researcher's name. There's someone that really researches social media. What the thing with social media is that the algorithms, how the algorithms are set up, and they could change the algorithms so that it is less of us getting sucked into our own holes of what we're interested in, and could create things that allow us to be able to see other perspectives and think critically. And I think there are ways that we could create social media that is a safer platform, and that is a platform that, allows us to come together rather than what it's doing right now.
Well, I can say that there are two companies that have terrible AI for algorithms. Number one, Apple. They don't have intelligence. Number two, YouTube, because it keeps giving me fireplace videos because I watched one fireplace video. That's all I get now on my suggestion feed for years now. I don't know why. I think it's the algorithm AI that is brain dead. Maybe. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. All you want is fireplace videos. Anyway,
I would like a real fireplace.
That'd be nice.
Yeah. Allison, I really appreciate your time, and I really do appreciate your input. I think this is an important conversation piece for audiophiles, because my opinion, maybe it's pop psychology, but my opinion is that people in niche groups like audiophiles lose perspective, and they get sucked into the idea of greatness and forget that the reality, forget the financial reality, forget the emotional reality, psychological reality. They become mean and toxic, and that breeds more toxicity in their lives, or at least toxicity in the community, if not, their day-to-day physical lives.
Yeah.
And I just want people to be cognizant that it's just a hobby. Your life doesn't depend on it. It shouldn't depend on it. And if it does depend on it, there are ways to have other meaning in life. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think so.
What is there a message you would want to give to anybody who just finds meaning in audio gear, in being part of the very small group that is audiophiles? Is there something you could tell them that could help them understand that there's a world much bigger out there for them that will be much more or equally inviting and welcoming and warm?
I guess I would want to say is that there's nothing wrong with a hobby, no matter what it is. So if it's, audio gear, and that is something you love to play with and explore and listen with and, get nerd out on it, like, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I think where it can be detrimental is if it is interfering with other areas of your life, is if that's financially, if it is relationally, if it's those are the two big ones that come to mind right now. But so if it's interfering in those ways and harming you in some way, then of course probably need to look at it and be like, okay, maybe I need to come at this hobby a little differently. A conversation we kind of have, but one that I think we often, you and I, disagree on a little bit, and that is maybe we don't disagree, but we have different viewpoints of it. And that is, right, I think with a hobby that is around gear, we can get fixated on stuff, and stuff doesn't usually make us happy. Usually that is an internal process. And if that internal process is through, you do your work through going to therapy, if you do your work through, meditating and mindfulness, if you do your work through reading, different insightful books that allow you to think of yourself and the world indifferently, there's all different ways to do one's own healing and work. You can do it in community, right? Sometimes, being in community with family, friends, they allow us to see things differently and to question things. And so that is where I think hobbies can sometimes create, maybe a false sense of, I don't want to say enjoyment, but, just like a false sense maybe of
Happiness.
Yeah. And not that it doesn't give you happiness. I think hobbies do, right? And getting things can bring us happiness, and and playing with the new toy can bring us happiness. But it doesn't usually create that long lasting happiness.
Well, thank you very much for your time. I hope that we can continue these sorts of conversations from time to time. I think it's important for audiophiles or anybody in any hobby really, to understand that there are outside influences that impact us. Even people who are resilient to it or believe that they're resilient to it, there's something you can gain from conversations like these, that there's a different perspective out there. And for those who are resilient to the influence, I think people will need to make a decision at some point. Do they want to be a good influence, like a good counter influence to the bad influence? And how will they use that ability? Yeah. But I really do appreciate your time, and I appreciate you being so open about your opinions and your expertise. And I hope that we can continue these conversations in the future. Thank you very much, Allison.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.